Take off your wedding ring. My wife whispered 12 minutes before the richest man in the ballroom called me his business partner. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. The corridor outside the Grand Meridian Ballroom was filled with soft piano music, polished marble, and the quiet hum of people who wore confidence as naturally as tailored suits. Madison stood close enough for me to smell the light citrus perfume she had worn since our first anniversary. Her smile remained perfectly composed, but her fingers were already reaching for my left hand. "What did you say?" I asked. She glanced toward the open doors behind us, where executives, investors, and political donors moved beneath crystal chandeliers. Then she lowered her voice. "Brandon thinks I'm separated. I need him to keep thinking that tonight." Her thumb pressed beneath the gold band I had worn for 12 years. She twisted it once, carefully, as if she were removing a price tag from something she no longer wanted people to see. The ring slid over my knuckle and disappeared into her silver clutch. I looked at the pale line it left around my finger. It was such a small thing, barely wider than a quarter-inch, but the empty space felt colder than the air-conditioned hallway. "You told your boss we're separated?" I asked. Madison exhaled through her nose and looked past me, checking whether anyone important was approaching. "I didn't exactly say that. He assumed it, and I didn't correct him. That's called lying." Her expression tightened. "Please don't make this dramatic, Ethan. Tonight matters. Brandon is making his recommendation for the vice president position, and he believes senior leadership needs people who are completely flexible. No complications. No divided priorities." I looked at her for a long moment. 12 years earlier, she had stood in a small church outside Boston and promised that whatever came next, we would face it as partners. Now, in the hallway of a corporate gala, she had reduced our marriage to a complication. "And I am the divided priority?" I asked. "That's not what I said. You took off my ring." She reached for my wrist, but I moved my hand to my side before she could touch it. Her eyes flashed with irritation, then softened into the expression she used during difficult meetings, calm enough to look reasonable, firm enough to end the discussion. "Just for tonight," she said. "Let me handle Brandon. Don't introduce yourself as my husband. Say you're a family friend or someone I know from Boston. We can talk about this when we get home." The words landed quietly. That was what made them worse. She had prepared them. This was not panic. It was strategy. She had chosen a cover story, rehearsed an explanation, and waited until we were 30 feet from the ballroom to tell me my place in it. Behind her, a server carried a tray of champagne through the doorway. Golden light spilled across the marble and caught the edge of Madison's clutch, the same clutch holding the only visible proof that we had once promised not to hide from each other. "How long has Brandon believed you're separated?" I asked. Her gaze shifted for half a second. That was enough. I had been married to her too long not to recognize the pause before a careful answer. "A few months," she said. The music from inside seemed to fade, though I knew it had not. A few months meant office dinners, private conversations, strategy sessions, and every ordinary evening when she came home, set her phone face down, and told me work had been exhausting. I wanted to ask what else she had allowed Brandon to believe. I wanted to know what she thought she would gain by erasing me. Instead, I kept my voice level. "What exactly did he promise you?" Madison opened her mouth, but the ballroom doors swung wider before she could answer. A woman with a headset smiled at us and announced that the host would begin his remarks in 10 minutes. Madison's entire posture changed. Her shoulders lifted, her smile returned, and the wife standing in front of me became the executive everyone inside expected to see. "We need to go," she said. She stepped through the doors without waiting for my answer. I followed her into a room filled with nearly 400 guests, all gathered to celebrate Vail Meridian Holdings, a company Madison believed I had once done minor consulting work for. She did not know I still owned more than a quarter of it. She did not know the acquisition her company desperately needed was sitting inside in my inside jacket pocket. And she certainly did not know that Jonathan Vail, the billionaire whose name appeared above the stage, had spent the past hour asking his staff why his business partner had not arrived. Madison moved ahead of me, already searching the crowd for Brandon. I looked down once more at my bare hand and understood that the evening had changed before it had even begun. My wife thought she had hidden our marriage to protect her future. What she had actually done was show me exactly how she planned to build it. Madison moved through the ballroom as if the last 5 minutes had never happened. She greeted people by name, touched elbows, laughed at comments that were not funny, and made every conversation look effortless. I followed 3 steps behind her, close enough to appear invited, far enough to look unimportant. The Grand Meridian Ballroom had been designed to make ordinary people feel small. Crystal chandeliers hung above white linen tables. A jazz trio played near the stage. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered against the dark like another expensive decoration. Madison belonged in rooms like this, or at least she had spent years teaching herself how to look as though she did. She stopped beside a tall man with silver at his temples and a black tuxedo that fit him too well to be rented. I recognized him from the acquisition files before she introduced us. Brandon Shaw, regional president of Halcyon Aerospace. The man who controlled Madison's promotion. The man who believed my wife was separated. His attention settled on her first, warm and approving, then shifted to me with the careful uncertainty people reserve for someone they cannot immediately place. Brandon, Madison said, this is Ethan. He is an old family friend from Boston. The words were smooth. No hesitation. No guilt. She had practiced them more than once. Brandon extended his hand. His grip was firm, his smile polished. Good to meet you, Ethan. What brings you to the gala? I looked at Madison. She was already watching me, silently reminding me to follow the script. Madison invited me. I said. It was true, just not complete. Brandon lifted one eyebrow. That was generous of her. These invitations are difficult to get. He said it lightly, but the message sat beneath the words. You do not belong here. A server passed with champagne. Brandon took a glass from Madison without asking and handed it to her, as if he knew her habits. She thanked him with the smile she used to give me when we were younger, before every dinner became a review of schedules and unfinished tasks. So what do you do, Ethan? He asked. I could have answered in a dozen ways. I could have told him I helped build the company paying for the lights above his head. I could have told him that his board had spent the past 6 weeks waiting for my approval. Instead, I kept my voice even. I do some consulting and private investment work. Brandon nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something disappointing. A little of this, a little of that. Something like that. He glanced at Madison. So you are the ambitious one. 2 executives beside him laughed politely. Madison laughed with them. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough to show she was comfortable with the joke. That small sound pressed harder against my ribs than it should have. 12 years of marriage can teach you the difference between nervous laughter and agreement. Hers was agreement. Brandon turned back to me. Madison has been carrying one of the most demanding strategy teams in the company. Long hours, constant travel, impossible deadlines. It takes a certain kind of person to keep up with that. She has always worked hard, I said. I know. His answer came too quickly. Madison looked down at her champagne. I noticed then how close they stood. Nothing improper. Nothing obvious. Just the practiced familiarity of 2 people who had shared more private conversations than I had been told about. Brandon smiled again. I suppose flexible work gives you plenty of time at home. One of the executives asked whether I managed the household while Madison traveled. Another joked that every successful woman needed someone to make dinner. The laughter returned, smoother now because Madison had given them permission. I watched her face, waiting for even the smallest correction. She could have said I was her husband. She could have said my work mattered. She could have stopped them with 5 ordinary words. Instead, she took another sip. Ethan prefers a quieter life, she said. Brandon tilted his head. That must be convenient. My bare finger felt exposed beneath the ballroom lights. I slipped my left hand into my pocket and touched the edge of the unsigned acquisition agreement. $420 million. Hundreds of jobs. Months of negotiations. 1 blank line with my name beneath it. Madison had no idea how close her career stood to that empty space. Brandon looked between us. How exactly do you 2 know each other? For the first time, Madison lost her rhythm. We are not exactly. She stopped. The sentence hung between us, unfinished but clear. Not exactly together. Not exactly married. Not exactly anything she wanted this room to recognize. Brandon accepted the implication with a quiet smile. I did not correct her. I wanted to see how far she would let the lie travel when she believed there would be no cost. Then the conversation around us began to thin. Heads turned toward the far side of the ballroom. The jazz music continued, but the voices lowered one by one. Jonathan Vale had entered the room. Brandon straightened immediately and adjusted his jacket. Madison placed her glass on a passing tray and prepared the smile she had been saving all evening. Jonathan greeted a senator, passed 2 members of his board, and ignored the line of executives moving toward him. Then his eyes found me. He stopped. Even from 50 feet away, I saw recognition spread across his face. Brandon stepped forward to intercept him. Jonathan walked straight past him. Jonathan Vale crossed the ballroom with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never needed to prove he belonged anywhere. Conversations softened as he passed. Board members stepped aside. Donors turned toward him with prepared smiles. Brandon moved into his path and extended his hand, but Jonathan barely slowed. His eyes stayed on me. Then his face opened into the kind of smile I had not seen in months. "There you are," he said. His voice carried farther than he intended, or perhaps exactly as far as he intended. "I have been looking everywhere for my business partner." The words reached our circle and changed the air around it. Brandon's hand remained suspended for half a second before he lowered it. Madison went completely still. One of the executives beside her stopped smiling. Jonathan reached me and pulled me into a brief embrace, one hand landing warmly on my shoulder. "You said you would arrive before dinner," he said. "I was starting to think you had abandoned me to make the speech alone." "I got delayed in the hallway," I said. My eyes moved toward Madison. Hers dropped to my bare hand. Jonathan followed my glance. He knew me too well to miss the silence between us. "Ethan," Brandon said, recovering quickly, "I did not realize you were connected to Vale Meridian." Jonathan turned toward him at last. "Connected?" He gave a quiet laugh. "Ethan built half of what you see around you." Brandon's expression shifted, but only slightly. Men like him practice disappointment in private and confidence in public. "Of course," he said. I understood that he had done some consulting. "Consulting," Jonathan repeated. He looked at me, amused. "That is one way to describe 20 years of keeping me from making expensive mistakes." The executives near us exchanged glances. Madison's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. I could see the silver edge of her clutch beneath her arm. My wedding ring was inside it, hidden less than 3 feet from a man who had attended our ceremony. Jonathan turned to her with genuine warmth. "Madison, it is good to see you again." She found her voice, though it came out thinner than before. "You remember me?" "Certainly. Ethan spoke about you for years before I finally met you." He looked between us. I was beginning to wonder why he had not introduced you tonight. Brandon answered before she could. Madison introduced Ethan as an old family friend. Jonathan's smile disappeared. Not dramatically. It simply left his face. He looked at me again, then at my left hand. "Where is your ring?" The question was quiet, but everyone around us heard it. Madison set her glass onto a passing tray too quickly. A few drops of champagne touched her fingers. She wiped them against a cocktail napkin while searching for an answer that would not expose the truth. "It is being resized," she said. The lie arrived smoothly, almost beautifully. That hurt more than the first one. Jonathan's eyes stayed on me. He did not challenge her. He waited. I could have protected her then. For 12 years, that had been my instinct. Smooth the rough edge. Redirect the conversation. Take the pressure into myself so she could walk away untouched. Marriage had trained me to cover for the person standing beside me. But marriage was the very thing she had chosen to hide. "It fit when we left home," I said. Nothing in my voice rose. Nothing needed to. The room around us seemed to contract by an inch. Madison looked at me with a warning in her eyes, the same look she had given me in the hallway when she asked me not to complicate her future. Jonathan glanced at the clutch beneath her arm. Understanding moved across his face slowly, then settled into something colder than anger. Disappointment. "I see," he said. Brandon cleared his throat. "Perhaps this is not the place for a personal discussion." "You are right," Jonathan replied. "This is a business event." He turned toward me. "Which makes this the perfect place to discuss business." Brandon's posture loosened, relieved to be back on familiar ground. "We are all very excited about the Halcyon transaction," he said. "My team has worked around the clock to make sure everything is ready for approval." Madison nodded quickly. "The final projections were delivered this morning." I studied her face. She had no idea I had read those projections before breakfast. She did not know my analysts had marked 3 inconsistencies in red. She did not know the approval document in my pocket was still unsigned. Jonathan rested one hand on my shoulder and faced the group. "Then you understand why Ethan's presence matters." No acquisition above $250 million moves forward without his authorization. The color left Brandon's confidence by degrees. Madison stared at me as though I had become a stranger while standing in front of her. Maybe I had. Or maybe I was finally the man she had never bothered to know. For $120 million, Jonathan continued. Hundreds of jobs. A major expansion. Ethan has the final signature. No one laughed now. The silence was so complete that I could hear the soft clink of silverware from the nearest table. Madison's gaze moved from my face to my jacket, as if she could see the contract through the fabric. Then Jonathan leaned closer and lowered his voice. Are we still signing tonight? I looked at my wife, at the clutch holding my ring, and at Brandon, who had spent the evening treating me like an inconvenience. I came here prepared to, I said, but I have learned a few things since I arrived. Jonathan studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod that only I understood. He did not press for an answer in front of Brandon. He had built too many companies and survived too many negotiations to mistake silence for uncertainty. We have 10 minutes before the remarks, he said. Come find me near the stage when you are ready. Then he turned to greet the board members gathering behind him, leaving Madison, Brandon, and me standing in a circle that no longer felt balanced. Brandon began speaking about revised projections, but his voice faded beneath an older memory. 20 years earlier, there had been no ballroom, no crystal chandeliers, and no acquisition worth $420 million. There had been a rented office above a hardware store in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 2 second-hand desks, 1 unreliable coffee maker, and a radiator that clanged through every winter morning. Jonathan had been 41 then, recently dismissed from a large investment firm after refusing to support a deal he believed would fail. I was 22, fresh out of college, carrying more student debt than confidence, and working nights to cover rent on a narrow apartment 6 blocks away. We met because I corrected one of his financial models during an interview. Most applicants would have stayed quiet. I pointed to a column on the 3rd page and told him his assumptions were wrong. He stared at the numbers for nearly a minute, then asked how quickly I could start. Vale Meridian did not have a name yet. It barely had electricity. Jonathan brought in clients because he could walk into a room full of skeptical executives and make them believe the future was already waiting for them. I stayed behind with spreadsheets, legal pads, and stacks of industry reports, searching for the risks optimism tended to overlook. He saw opportunity. I measured the distance to the ground. Together, we became difficult to fool. Our first major client was a regional manufacturer in Ohio that wanted to expand too quickly. Everyone else praised the plan. My model showed that a 12% drop in orders would leave the company unable to meet payroll within 8 months. Jonathan trusted me enough to recommend a slower expansion, even though it meant accepting a smaller fee. A year later, the market turned. The manufacturer survived while 3 competitors closed plants. That decision brought us more business than any advertisement could have purchased. We worked 14-hour days, ate takeout at our desks, and measured success by whether the checks cleared before rent was due. Jonathan was the public face because he enjoyed the room. I preferred the quiet after everyone left, when the numbers stopped performing and started telling the truth. By our 5th year, we had 30 employees and offices on 2 floors. By our 10th, Vale Meridian was advising corporations across the country. Reporters called Jonathan a visionary. He corrected them whenever I was nearby, but I never needed my photograph beside his. I owned part of the company, helped direct every major investment, and still took the subway to work. Power felt cleaner when it did not need an audience. The hardest year came during the financial crisis. Several firms that had once ignored us suddenly wanted help. One of our largest investments was exposed to losses that could have pulled the entire company under. Jonathan wanted to move quickly. I asked for 48 hours. I spent 2 nights reviewing contracts and found a protection clause buried deep inside an agreement written years earlier. It gave us a legal path to limit the damage, but using it required us to abandon a profitable partnership before anyone else understood why. Jonathan did not question me. He signed. We lost money that quarter, but we survived. 12 months later, firms 10 times our size were gone, and Vale Meridian was stronger than before. That was when Jonathan gave me a small gold ring engraved with 2 words, "Build quietly." I wore it on my right hand for years, until Madison and I married, and I placed a simpler band on my left. She knew I had helped start an investment company, She knew Jonathan and I were close. What she never asked was how much of Vale Meridian still belonged to me. At first, that had felt like proof that money did not matter to her. Later, I began to wonder whether she had simply decided my quiet life meant there was nothing worth asking about. Brandon's voice pulled me back into the ballroom. "Ethan, are you listening?" he asked. I was explaining why the halcyon projections are stronger than they appear. I looked at him, then at Madison. She had regained her professional smile, but fear had begun to gather behind it. "I heard you," I said. "I have also read the projections." Brandon paused. "The internal projections?" "Every page." Madison's eyes widened. The music softened as the event coordinator approached the microphone. Jonathan was waiting near the stage, one hand resting on the end-signed podium notes. I reached into my jacket and felt the edge of the contract again. The company Jonathan and I had built in silence was about to become the loudest truth in the room. The event coordinator welcomed the guests and asked everyone to take their seats, but Madison stayed beside me as the crowd began moving toward the tables. Brandon had stepped away to speak with 2 members of the Halcyon board, leaving us alone for the first time since Jonathan crossed the ballroom. Madison lowered her voice. "Why did you never tell me?" I looked at her. "Tell you what? Do not do that, Ethan. Jonathan just said you built Vale Meridian. He said you control the final approval. How much of that company belongs to you?" The question came with urgency, but not wonder. She did not ask what the work had cost me. She did not ask why I had chosen to remain private. She asked how much. 27%, I said. Her expression changed so quickly that it almost looked like the lights had shifted. 27% of Vale Meridian Holdings? Through the Cole Family Trust. She stared at me. Around us, servers placed covered plates on tables, and the jazz trio finished its last song before the speeches. The room kept moving while our marriage stood still. "That could be worth billions," she whispered. "It is worth whatever the market says it is worth. You let me believe you were doing small consulting projects from home. I told you I managed private investments and advised Jonathan. That is not the same thing." "No, it is not." Her eyes hardened. Why would a husband hide something like this from his wife? The irony settled between us so heavily that neither of us could step around it. Less than 20 minutes earlier, she had removed my wedding ring because admitting I was her husband threatened the image she wanted to present. Now she was accusing me of concealment. I kept my voice calm. I did not hide our marriage. Her fingers closed around the silver clutch. "This is different. It usually feels different when the secret belongs to you." She looked toward the tables to make sure no one was listening. "I made one professional decision under pressure. You kept an entire fortune from me for years. I could have defended myself with numbers, legal agreements, and dates. Instead, I remembered why I had stepped away in the first place. 6 years earlier, I had been standing in Vale Meridian's Boston office during a quarterly review when the room suddenly seemed too bright. My chest tightened. My hands went cold. I tried to continue speaking, but Jonathan saw my face and called for help. The doctors later told me it had been a serious cardiac warning, not a full heart attack, but close enough to change the way I measured time. I was 36 years old. I had spent most of my adult life building a company and almost none of it learning how to live outside one. For 3 months, I slept badly, walked every morning, and listened to the silence in our house. Madison had been kind then. She brought me coffee, attended appointments, and told me she did not care if I ever returned to the office. I believed her. I reduced my public role, moved my shares into a family trust, and continued advising Jonathan from home. I stopped attending conferences. I stopped giving interviews. I traded tailored suits for plain jackets and a black sedan for an 8-year-old Ford. The money remained, but I removed it from the center of my life. I wanted mornings with my wife, dinners without a telephone on the table, and a home where no one needed my net worth before deciding how much respect to offer me. At first, Madison seemed relieved. Then her career accelerated. Her invitations became more exclusive. Her conversations filled with titles, promotions, and people whose names appeared in business magazines. The quieter I became, the more she treated quietness like failure. She never asked to see the trust documents. She never asked how our mortgage had been paid off early or why market downturns never changed our lifestyle. She had access to our household accounts and everything required for our shared life. What she did not have was control over the company I had built before our marriage. I stayed private because I wanted something real, I told her. I wanted to know that the people closest to me saw a man, not a balance sheet. Madison's face softened for a second, but then her gaze moved toward Jonathan, the stage, and the executives watching from across the room. I am your wife. I had a right to know who you were. You knew who I was. I glanced at the clutch in her hand. You just decided that man was not impressive enough to claim tonight. She looked down. The pale reflection of the chandeliers moved across the metal clasp. Somewhere inside, my ring rested beside her lipstick and business cards, reduced to another object she could take out when it became useful again. The event coordinator announced Jonathan's name, and applause rolled across the ballroom. He stepped to the microphone, thanked the guests, then looked directly at me. Before we discuss the future of Vale Meridian, he said, I would like to recognize the partner who made that future possible. Every face turned in my direction. Madison reached for my arm. Ethan, please, she whispered. Do not make a decision tonight because you are angry. I gently removed her hand. I am not angry, I said. I am finally paying attention. Applause filled the ballroom, but it reached me as a distant sound, softened by the look on Madison's face. Jonathan stood beneath the gold light of the stage, one hand resting on the podium, waiting for me to move. For years, I had avoided moments like this. I had built my life around remaining useful without becoming visible. Now 400 people were turning in their chairs to see the man Jonathan Vale had just called his partner. I walked toward the stage slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because every step gave me time to understand what Madison had done. Behind me, Brandon began speaking to her in a low voice. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. You said he had no active role. Madison answered quickly. That is what I believed. You told me he barely worked. Keep your voice down. Jonathan met me at the stairs and extended his hand. When I reached the podium, he did not introduce me with a list of achievements. He told the room about the first office above the hardware store, the winter our pipes froze, and the night we nearly lost everything before finding a clause that saved the company. His voice carried pride, but I could feel Madison watching from the crowd. She was not listening to the story. She was calculating its value. Ethan never wanted the spotlight, Jonathan said. But there would be no Vale Meridian without his judgment, his discipline, and his refusal to approve a deal simply because everyone else wanted it. That final sentence changed the mood around Brandon's table. Several members of the Halcyon board looked toward him. He shifted in his seat and adjusted his cuff. I saw Madison open her clutch beneath the table. For 1 second, I thought she might return my ring. Instead, she reached for her telephone. The screen lit her face. A message appeared. Before she tilted it away, I only saw the sender's name. Brandon. Jonathan continued speaking, but my attention narrowed. Madison read the message, typed a reply, then placed the telephone face down beside her plate. Her movements were controlled, but the muscles in her jaw had tightened. When Jonathan invited me to say a few words, I stepped closer to the microphone. I have always believed good decisions begin when people stop performing and start telling the truth, I said. The room became quiet. Tonight is meant to celebrate partnership. Real partnership requires transparency, especially when the stakes involve employees, shareholders, and families who depend on the promises made in rooms like this. Brandon stared at me without blinking. Madison lowered her eyes. I could have announced the acquisition. The folder inside my jacket contained the final terms, the financing schedule, and the page waiting for my signature. Instead, I thanked the guests and stepped away. The applause that followed was polite but uncertain. People could sense an unfinished sentence even when they could not name it. As Jonathan greeted the next speaker, his chief legal officer, Rachel Bennett, approached me near the side of the stage. She had worked with us for 15 years and knew how to read my silences. You saw the morning report? She asked. 3 discrepancies, I said. The revenue recognition schedule, the vendor payments, and the projected savings. Rachel nodded. There is more. One of Brandon's outside consulting firms is registered to an address connected to his brother. I looked across the ballroom. Brandon was speaking to Madison again, this time with his hand pressed flat against the table between them. She shook her head once. He said something sharper. She looked toward me. How long have you known? I asked Rachel. We confirmed the address this afternoon. We were waiting for you before freezing the review. Do it now. She studied my face. The entire transaction? Pause the acquisition. Begin a full audit. Preserve every communication connected to Halcyon's projections. Rachel gave one precise nod and stepped away with her telephone already in her hand. I returned to the table while the next speaker discussed growth, innovation, and trust. Brandon greeted me with a smile that arrived too late. Impressive remarks, he said. You certainly surprised all of us. I did not intend to. Madison never mentioned the extent of your involvement. Madison and I are discovering several things we never mentioned. Her face tightened. Brandon leaned closer. Whatever happened earlier was a misunderstanding. She has worked harder than anyone on this deal. I know. She is also the strongest candidate for vice president. Madison looked at him sharply, but he continued. Her promotion would place someone reliable in a position to support the integration. The meaning sat beneath the sentence. He was not praising her. He was reminding her of an arrangement. I looked at Madison. Is that why he believed we were separated? She did not answer. Brandon gave a quiet laugh. Personal impressions have nothing to do with business. Then why did my marriage need to disappear before her promotion could appear? The color drained from Madison's face. Brandon looked toward the stage, searching for an escape inside the noise of the program. I did not raise my voice. What did he ask you to do? I said. Madison held the clutch against her lap with both hands. Ethan, not here. You chose here. Her eyes filled with something between fear and regret. Then she whispered the truth. Brandon had promised to recommend her for vice president if she could help move the acquisition forward. He believed my old connection to Vale Meridian might give her access to private concerns, internal opinions, or anything that could make the approval easier. She had invited me to the gala not because she wanted me beside her, but because she hoped I might be useful while remaining invisible. My ring had not been hidden only to protect an image. It had been hidden to protect a plan. For several seconds, the only sound between us was the applause rising for the speaker on stage. Madison sat with both hands wrapped around the silver clutch, as if holding it tightly enough could keep the truth contained. Brandon looked toward the nearest table, pretending to listen to the presentation, but the tension in his jaw told me he was measuring every possible consequence. You brought me here to help him, I said. Madison shook her head. Not like that. Then explain it. She looked at Brandon, but he offered no rescue. The man who had promised her a promotion suddenly found the centerpiece fascinating. Brandon knew you had worked with Vale Meridian, she said. He thought you might still know people on the investment team. People? I asked. He wanted insight. Nothing confidential. Just a sense of what was slowing the approval. Brandon finally turned toward me. That is standard relationship management, Ethan. Companies use professional connections every day. Professional connections do not require a woman to pretend she is separated from her husband. His smile thinned. That was Madison's choice. She looked at him as if the floor beneath her had shifted. You said the board preferred executives without domestic complications. I said availability matters at the senior level. You told me being perceived as independent would help. Perceived by whom? I asked. Madison's eyes returned to mine. The answer was already there. Brandon had not simply allowed her lie. He had encouraged it. He wanted her ambitious, uncertain, and grateful for his approval. A married executive with a stable home might question him. A woman who believed her future depended entirely on his recommendation was easier to direct. How many times did you discuss me? I asked. Madison swallowed. A few. How many? I do not know. You remember. She glanced toward the stage, where the speaker was describing trust as the foundation of successful partnerships. The word floated across the ballroom and landed between us with almost cruel precision. 6 or 7 times, she said. He asked what you did, whether you still spoke to Jonathan, whether you knew anything about the committee. And what did you tell him? That you kept your work private. What else? Her fingers moved to the clasp of the clutch, opening it a fraction before closing it again. That you did not care about corporate politics. That you would probably answer if I asked. Casually, the sentence settled into me slowly. I thought about the questions she had started asking over the past 2 months. Whether Jonathan seemed worried about the market. Whether Vale Meridian was reducing aerospace exposure. Whether I knew why the Halcyon review had been delayed. She had asked them over breakfast, while folding laundry, while we walked through our neighborhood after dinner. I had mistaken those moments for renewed interest in my life. They had been research. You were gathering information, I said. I was trying to understand the deal. For Brandon. For my team. For your promotion. She looked down. That was answer enough. Brandon leaned toward me, lowering his voice. Let us be practical. Madison has talent. I offered her an opportunity to demonstrate initiative. Whatever assumptions were made about your marriage are irrelevant to the transaction. Not anymore. His confidence flickered. You would not interfere with a $420 million acquisition over a personal disagreement. I would not. I let the silence stretch until he almost relaxed. I would interfere because the projections contain irregularities, because one of your consulting vendors appears connected to your family, and because you try to use my wife as an unofficial channel into a confidential review. Madison turned sharply toward him. What consulting vendor? Brandon's face remained composed, but his eyes changed. This is not the place. You told me every outside contract had been cleared, she said. It was cleared. By whom? He did not answer. For the first time that evening, Madison looked at him without admiration. She looked at him the way people look at a door after realizing it has locked behind them. Did you know the projections were wrong? I asked her. No, her answer came quickly. I knew some numbers were preliminary, but Brandon said finance would reconcile them before closing. Did you forward those numbers to anyone? She hesitated. Madison, I sent a summary to Rachel's office last week. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from recognition. Rachel had flagged that summary because its savings estimates did match Halcyon's supporting documents. Madison had not created the false numbers, but she had carried them forward because questioning Brandon might have cost her the promotion. Ambition had not made her dishonest all at once. It had taught her to stop asking whether the truth was complete. Brandon stood. I am not going to sit here while a private marital issue is turned into a corporate accusation. I remained seated. Rachel Bennett froze the acquisition 5 minutes ago. He stopped. Madison's hand loosened around the clutch. A full audit begins tonight, I continued. Every vendor payment, every projection, every message connected to the transaction will be preserved. Brandon looked toward the exits, then toward the Halcyon board members seated across the ballroom. The polished certainty drained from his posture. Madison opened her clutch and removed my wedding ring. It rested in her palm beneath the chandelier light, small and ordinary, and suddenly heavier than everything else on the table. She held it toward me. I closed my hand before she could place it inside. Not yet, I said. First, I need to know how much of our marriage became part of his deal. Madison kept the ring in her open palm, but I did not reach for it. For 12 years, that band had meant she would stand beside me when the room became uncomfortable. Tonight, she had removed it before anyone could question whether I belonged. Putting it back on would not change what had already been revealed. Brandon looked from the ring to my face, then gave a short, controlled laugh. This has gone far enough, he said. Several people at nearby tables turned toward us. He seemed to notice, because his voice became louder and smoother, shaped for an audience. Ethan, I understand that this evening has been personally upsetting, but freezing a major acquisition because your wife made a poor social decision would be irresponsible. He wanted the people around us to hear one version of the story before they heard mine. In his version, he was the steady executive protecting hundreds of employees. I was the embarrassed husband misusing authority. Madison closed her hand around the ring. Brandon, stop, she said. No, he replied. The Halcyon board deserves clarity. 2 board members had already begun moving toward our table. Jonathan noticed the gathering from across the ballroom and stepped away from a group of donors. Rachel followed him, holding her telephone against a folder of documents. Brandon straightened as they approached. He looked relieved. He still believed a public setting would protect him. Jonathan, he said, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Ethan appears to have paused the acquisition over a private disagreement involving Madison. Jonathan looked at me. Did you? No. That single word settled the question for him. Rachel opened the folder. The review was paused because our compliance team confirmed undisclosed connections between Halcyon vendors and members of senior management. We also identified unsupported figures in the projected savings report. One of the Halcyon directors, a gray-haired woman named Diane Mercer, turned to Brandon. You told us those figures had been independently verified. They were reviewed internally, he said. Rachel is exaggerating a routine disclosure issue because Ethan is angry. His words came faster now. The confidence was still present, but it no longer fit him properly. Jonathan's gaze hardened. You should be careful about questioning my legal officer without evidence. Brandon raised both hands as if he were the only reasonable person at the table. I am simply pointing out the obvious. Ethan has been absent from daily operations for years. He appears at one gala, discovers that his wife has managed her professional image poorly, and suddenly a transaction involving $420 million is frozen. Anyone can see the connection. The nearby conversations had stopped. Even the servers moved more quietly around us. Brandon turned toward the board members, drawing strength from their attention. With respect, Ethan is a legacy shareholder, an honorary founder. He inherited a seat at the table and now wants everyone to believe he still built it. Madison whispered his name again, but he ignored her. He had chosen the last defense available to him. If he could not deny my authority, he would try to make it undeserved. I looked at Jonathan, who was ready to answer. I lifted one hand. He stopped. Brandon needed no help exposing himself. You think I inherited my position? I asked. I think Jonathan is loyal to an old friend, he said. That is admirable. It is not the same as active leadership. Who designed the risk model your team used to calculate the acquisition financing? He hesitated. Vale Meridian's analytics division. Who created the original system? His eyes shifted toward Rachel. She did not answer for him. I did, I said. Who requested the second review after Halcyon's cash flow estimates failed to match its vendor obligations? Brandon's face tightened. Your committee. I requested it. Diane Mercer looked at him. Another director stepped closer. I continued before he could interrupt. Who identified the 3 discrepancies in the report Madison forwarded last week? Madison's eyes lifted to mine. I did. Brandon tried to smile. Then perhaps you should have raised those concerns through normal channels. I did. Your office was asked twice for supporting documents. Rachel removed a printed page from the folder. Both requests were denied by Mr. Shaw personally. The silence changed. It was no longer social discomfort. It was recognition. Brandon looked at the paper as though it had appeared from nowhere. Those requests were premature. They were required, Diane said. You assured the board everything had been provided. He turned toward Madison. Tell them the delays were caused by Vale Meridian. You were in the meetings. Madison remained seated, the wedding ring hidden inside her closed hand. For months, she had shaped herself around his approval. Now he was asking her to carry his explanation in front of the same people he had tried to impress. She looked at him for a long moment. The documents were ready, she said quietly. You told us not to send them. Brandon's polished expression finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply disappeared. Jonathan turned to me. The program still includes the acquisition announcement, he said. I looked toward the stage, where the unsigned agreement waited beneath the podium lights. Then we should make an announcement, I said. Just not the one they expected. Jonathan walked toward the stage first, and I followed with Rachel at my side. Behind us, the ballroom remained quiet in the uneasy way a room becomes quiet when everyone realizes the evening has changed direction. The event coordinator stood near the podium holding a schedule card, her smile fixed but uncertain. Jonathan leaned close, said a few words, and she nodded before stepping away from the microphone. On the screen behind the stage, the Vale Meridian logo faded into the blue and silver Halcyon Aerospace emblem. Beneath both names appeared the words Strategic Acquisition Announcement. Applause began automatically. It was weaker than before. People had seen Brandon surrounded by board members. They had watched Rachel open her folder. They understood that the prepared celebration no longer matched the faces at the front of the room. Jonathan approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the next item on tonight's program was intended to mark an important expansion for Vale Meridian and Halcyon Aerospace. He paused. That announcement has changed. The applause stopped. I reached into my jacket and removed the acquisition agreement. The folder felt heavier than paper should have felt. $420 million, hundreds of employees, and months of negotiations had been compressed into a stack less than 1 inch thick. Jonathan stepped aside and gave me the microphone. I placed the folder on the podium, but did not open it immediately. From the stage, I could see Madison seated beside the empty chair Brandon had left behind. Her silver clutch rested on the table. Her right hand remained closed around my wedding ring. Brandon stood near the edge of the ballroom with 2 Halcyon directors and a member of Vale Meridian Security. No one was restraining him. No one needed to. His authority had already begun disappearing. This agreement requires 3 levels of approval, I said. The first belongs to Jonathan Vale. The second belongs to the investment committee. The third belongs to me. I opened the folder and lifted the signature page, so the nearest cameras could see it. Jonathan's name appeared on the first line. The committee authorization appeared beneath it. The final line was blank. I arrived tonight prepared to sign. A murmur moved across the ballroom. Our team had identified concerns, but I believed those concerns might be resolved with complete records and honest cooperation. I was willing to give Halcyon's leadership that opportunity. I looked toward Brandon. He stared back at me, his face composed again, but his hands were no longer still. Tonight, I learned that required documents were withheld after formal requests. I learned that projected savings were circulated without proper verification. I learned that an outside consulting company may have undisclosed ties to a senior executive's family. Several Halcyon board members exchanged looks. Diane Mercer stood near Brandon with her arms folded. Those issues alone require a full audit, I continued. The acquisition is therefore suspended, effective immediately. The room filled with whispers. I waited until they faded. But numbers are not the only reason transactions fail. Culture matters. Judgment matters. Character matters when no one believes the person standing in front of them has enough power to respond. Madison lowered her head. I had not planned to speak about us. Even then, I could have protected her. I could have separated the business decision from the private humiliation and allowed everyone to believe my bare hand meant nothing. But silence had protected too many lies already. Before entering this ballroom, my wife removed my wedding ring and asked me not to identify myself as her husband. The room became completely still. Madison closed her eyes. She had allowed a senior executive at Halcyon to believe we were separated because she believed that impression would improve her chances of promotion. She also believed my old relationship with Vale Meridian might provide information that could help this transaction move forward. I did not raise my voice. I am not suspending this acquisition because my pride was injured. I am suspending it because a leadership culture that rewards concealment in personal matters may also reward concealment in financial ones. Tonight, those two patterns met in the same room. I looked down at the blank signature line. For weeks, people had treated it as a formality. It was not. A signature is a promise that the person holding the pen accepts what comes after. I picked up the pen Jonathan had placed beside the folder. Brandon took one step forward. "Ethan," he called, loud enough for the room to hear. "You are making a serious mistake." I looked at him. "No. I am refusing to make one." I set the pen across the unsigned line and closed the folder. No applause followed. None was needed. Jonathan returned to the microphone and announced that Vale Meridian's compliance team would begin its review that night. Halcyon's board would receive instructions before midnight. Rachel moved toward Diane with the first set of preservation notices. Brandon stood alone as the people who had laughed beside him earlier quietly created distance. When I stepped down from the stage, Madison was waiting near the bottom of the stairs. She opened her hand. My ring lay against her palm, warm from being held too tightly. "Ethan," she whispered, "I was trying to build a future for us." I looked at the ring, then at her. "You built it around the idea that I did not exist.